conversation. We're so happy to have you. You heard that there's a recording in progress, and that's because there's a few people that registered and can't make it. And we're really wanting to share these conversations with people nationally. And so the team from Hummingbird House have kindly agreed to that. So thank you. So I'm Harpreet or Kelsey Smith, and I'm one of the directors at Compassionate Communities Australia, and I'll be facilitating today's session. And I just invite anyone, as we're starting to talk, to just put who you are in the chat and what Aboriginal lands that you're coming from today. So I'm joining from the lands of the Yugambeh people on the Gold Coast. And I'd really like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands that we are coming from today, elders past and present. So I guess the purpose of this conversation series is that Compassionate Communities Australia is a peak body that's, primarily our purpose is to connect and be a vehicle to share learnings from across the country when it comes to the creation of compassionate communities, how they operate, what challenges people are having, how they're overcoming them, and to be that vehicle of connection, learning, growth, and sharing in a really kind way. And because this is our first series, we really invite you all to be kind to us if there's any glitches or anything else, because it's our first conversation. So in terms of housekeeping, I'll be handing over to the team at Hummingbird House, so Kelly, Ellen, and Cara in a minute. But we ask that if you've got questions during the presentation that you just write them on a notepad or just keep them filed. And then we've got enough time for questions at the end. And, you can put your hand up or put questions in the chat, and then we will loop back that way. So I'll hand over to you now, Ellen, Kelly, and Cara. And if everyone can just make sure that you're muted for the presentation, just so that we can all hear, that would be wonderful. So take it away.
Thank you, Harp, for that introduction. We're really happy to be here sharing with you all a little bit about what we do at Hummingbird House, and we really appreciate Compassionate Communities Australia inviting us to share. It's great to see so many of you here from right across the country. I can't literally see many of you, but I know that you're out there, so thanks for making the time to join us today. I'm Cara, I'm the Community Development Worker at Hummingbird House, and as Harp said, I'm joined by Kelly, who's our Care Services Manager, and Ellen, who's the Manager of our Family and Community Support Team. I also just wanted to acknowledge Peter Westerby, the guy in the funny hat, is with us today as well. And Peter's been quite instrumental in a lot of this work that we're going to be talking about today. And he's been working with us as a community development practitioner previously. So while he's not presenting, he will, hopefully be able to add something to the discussion at the end as well. So just to give you a bit of an idea of what we're going to cover today. So as Harp said, there'll be plenty of time at the end for discussion and questions. So we really encourage you to ask us any questions. We're also happy to chat offline. We'll leave our contact details as well. So if there's anything you want to have a more detailed chat about, we're happy to be contacted. So we'll give you a bit of an overview about Hummingbird House for those of you that don't know much about us, so who we are, what we do. We're going to talk about why, as a children's hospice, we've decided to invest in compassionate communities. We're going to look at our approach to community development and take a look at what that actually looks like in action. So we'll share a few case studies or stories to kind of illustrate what that looks like on the ground. We'll touch on some of the challenges and opportunities, and as we said before, there'll be time for Q&A at the end. So over to you, Ellen. Oh, Kelly, sorry. Oh, no, Ellen. Sorry.
I was muted. That's why I was not getting any response. Hello, everyone. I'm just checking you can see the large session overview and not any other slides before I get going. This is kind of, yeah, a lot of
Yeah.
logistics here. And you can hear me now too, so we're good to go. Hello again. Thank you so much to, just everyone who's helped put this together. And it's so great to see so many people online. Just want to start with an acknowledgement to, both the country and land that Hummingbird House is on. We're on Yagara Turrbal land here in Meanjin. And also, really just wanted to thank Compassionate Communities Australia and the many people working over the years to bring together a network like this. And I suppose two things to say before I hand over to Kelly for an overview of Hummingbird House as a service. We're sharing our insights today and our explorations of these approaches, as kind of informed, semi-informed explorers and collaborators in some cases. So this isn't being presented as an expert way to go about this, nor is it, a template for how, this would necessarily apply in other contexts. We're speaking specifically to how trying to apply compassionate communities approaches through the specific lens of community development has been, a learning experience for us. And certainly while we have the, wonderful resource of a community development worker here in our family support team, since the inception of children's hospices, across the world, there's been a commitment to family-centered care. And I think that is a big kind of bridging part out of patient-centered care. And we're taking that a step further with this, these approaches into network-centered care. So I wanted to start by, handing over to Kelly to talk more about what specifically this children's hospice, Hummingbird House, looks, sounds, and feels like. So I'll hand over to Kelly first.
Thank you, Ellen, and thank you for the opportunity to join in this conversation today. I get the privilege of giving you an overview and an introduction to Hummingbird House. And really, the foundations of Hummingbird House are grounded in community. So our co-founders back in 2009 were a local community couple that were fostering a child with a life-limiting condition. And through working and listening to the community members, what they realised is we really needed a children's hospice here in Queensland. And they worked with other families in the palliative care community to lobby for funding and fundraising and develop Queensland's only children's hospice. And we are the third children's hospice in Australia. So there's Bear Cottage in Sydney and Very Special Kids down in Melbourne. And there'll soon be a fourth children's hospice over in Western Australia. So that's really exciting. We developed our vision and values. So our vision is that every family in Queensland is connected to a community that knows how to care for them in life, death, and bereavement. And our values are focused around compassion. That's compassion and care for the whole family with clinical excellence and humility, connection through community, collaboration, and teamwork. And that's really grown and developed over the years since we opened. Celebration is so intrinsic to our model of care here at Hummingbird House and goes hands in hand with palliative care, paediatric palliative care. And that can look like fun and joy, ceremony and ritual. So as I mentioned, we're a statewide children's hospice, and we offer care and support to families all the way from northern New South Wales up to the Cape York Peninsula. And our service is an offering for children with life-limiting conditions, and that can be from the antenatal phase. We would accept referrals all the way up to age 18 and sometimes up to the age of 21. Now, out of our referrals, 20% of those families are outside that southeast Queensland area. And we do offer some in-home support, but we've really had to think and tweak around what this looks like over the years. So sometimes we can offer after-death care, so care for the child's body within the community, and that often looks like increasing community capacity to care for a child in that community, or grief care. Yeah, and really since 2019, so we opened in 2016, and although we've always been a statewide service, we've had to really think and look at our model of care and listen to the families. And so from 2019, we've been more invested around compassionate community and community development and what that looks like around the state, so we can reach more families. Thanks, Ellen. So what we do, we do have a hospice building, and that is here in the southeast corner of Queensland, in Brisbane, in Chermside. And the building itself was designed by families that had have a child with a life-limited condition, or maybe bereaved families that would have used a children's hospice had there been one. And we also consulted within the palliative care community, and the building is how the families imagined they wanted a home from home space, and in that building is 8 what we call our guest in care bedrooms, and we can offer short break stay, so a little bit like respite. We're able to respond to some crisis care, so some really last minute care, symptom management stays, which can support families that are not wanting to go into a hospital setting but feel they need a little bit of extra clinical support in a supported medical facility. We also provide some NDIS care, such as hydrotherapy and music therapy, and that entwines with our allied health offering. And we offer what we call holistic end of life and after death care within the hospice building. So that might be a family coming in from community for end-of-life care, or from a hospital setting. And that offering is also for the family and the wider family and community. We have our family and community support team. We all work very closely together under one model as an interdisciplinary team, and we can offer some specialist support with end-of-life and after-death care. That might look like ceremony, ritual. We can support funerals within the house or support within the community, navigate various systems. We work with schools and transitional care into bereavement, and we've developed a peer support program within that bereavement space. And since COVID, as most services, we've really sort of stepped into that telehealth space, which has grown the reach around the state that we can support families further. And this is a few photographs of the hospice itself. So you can see it is a medically supported, it's actually a licensed private hospital, but it is very warm and very friendly, and families talk about being able to take a breath and relax within the space, and be in a space where they can be understood by other families and find connection. And things that are important are the connection to the outdoor spaces. So wherever you are within the house, you have connection to the outdoors and the sky, and these photographs show the beautiful Queensland climate we have there in our backyard space. And the backyard space is a real important space for our families, siblings, for play and connection, but also over the years it's been used for family gatherings, family funerals, for end-of-life care for families that want to be in that outdoor space together as a community, the backyard space. And we have a rooftop space can be offered for that. And then we have an annual remembering ritual ceremony that uses the outdoor spaces. And throughout the house, there's warm timbers and all of the medical equipment like hidden behind cabinetry. So it's very, very bright and friendly, and really welcomes families of all sizes, and supports to provide that individualized care. Thanks, Helen.
Thanks so much, Kelly. And yeah, so that's kind of, for anyone who was less familiar with Hummingbird House as a service, that overview, and especially finishing on the building, I think links back to when we were first coming into real contact with compassionate communities and more of the public health approaches to palliative care. This is a very well-known, phrase or quote from Alan Kelleher, exploring those questions around the vast majority of care being done by family and support networks. So it is really wonderful that Queensland has a building and a bricks and mortar place like Hummingbird House for families to come to. As we started to ask questions in the early days of the service, we wondered how this translates from, this has often been applied in an adult palliative care context, so to working with children and young people who often have, kind of intersecting complex disability needs and multiple professional, home care teams. And evidence has shown us that one of the biggest costs on family life, is this transition away from social and community connection to where most people coming through their front door, if your child's receiving paediatric palliative care or has a life-limiting condition, most of those people who are not living in that home are paid to be there. So how might that percentage vary for children and young people, and what might be the associated impacts? And what unique resources we found ourselves wondering would these families and these communities hold as well. And so this next slide is really just a broad cross-section of a range of organizations and services that were, some of them we were formally partnered with, but I don't want to give the impression that that's the case for all of them, but certainly all of them inspired, contributed, kind of fed into part of, considerations and thinking here. And I think particularly, when we think about why compassionate communities, we had the privilege of drawing in a combined and kind of syncretic way in putting together not only the hospice service, but particularly the family and community support team. And one of the things I think there that was really strong was an existing knowledge and some skills and training from some of us in a natural death, approaches to community death care, this return to, kind of bringing death and dying back into community spaces where it had maybe been drawn away and over medicalized. So Groundswell and Natural Death Care Centre were really, strong inspirations for us in that space, and friends and mentors in various ways. And obviously compassionate cities and then compassionate communities kind of linking over into that healthcare space. And for us specifically as a service, East Anglia Children's Hospice over in the UK, and the Queensland Children's Hospital, but particularly paediatric palliative care team, Dr. Anthony Herbert, really not only understanding, but walking alongside, from the very earliest days of Hummingbird House, but also as we started to expand into this community development space. So for us, it was going to the Compassionate Community Symposium in Sydney that was jointly organised by Palliative Care Australia and Groundswell, and hearing, Julian Abel and others speak, then being able to come back home to our local partners, to PPCS, Wesley Mission Queensland, and coming back home with this particular document was really a framework that led us in the direction we've gone. And if you're not familiar with it, essentially it comes out of the National Ambitions for Palliative Care in the UK, and has, just a real roadmap of application for how to do community development in end-of-life care. The maybe second chapter is directions for hospices, and the very first thing it advises hospices to do is to employ a community development worker. So we did what we were told, essentially, is how we got here. And just, in a broader sense, and sparing you too much of a history lesson, Kelly's talked a bit about the foundation and development of the service, and that obviously sought to bring family voice and experience in from that foundational state. And so it was in this second or middle place as the service was taking flight that we really were asking questions about what this would mean for especially the family support side of the service, but for a service more broadly. And so I think it's just helpful to maybe acknowledge that was able to happen from the earlier stages because of an interdisciplinary approach from our staff, and we were able to draw on existing skills and knowledge from both across community and health contexts, which include palliative care, community development, but also, as I said, like this passion for, I can go either way and talk about re-empowering, but this idea of giving agency and choice back to families, particularly around death care, was something that was foundational to how this service was established and grew. So, this unique foundation, I think, set the scene for an emerging model of care. And yeah, I just need to acknowledge again, as we were getting into that, getting into those spaces and trying to make sense of how it looks at a children's hospice specifically, a longtime friend, colleague, and mentor, Dr. Lee Donovan, was able to really help draw this together for us in a report of what sustainable approaches to service delivery would look like. And again, community development was underscored there. So that's how we got here. And then linking in with Dr. Peter Westerby and others around what that looked like from a community development perspective specifically, were some conversations that then started. So I'll hand over now to Cara now to talk more specifically around that community development piece.
Thanks, Ellen. So yeah, so you've heard us mention community development quite a few times already, and this has really been the approach and method that we've taken to this work of exploring, how we can be helpful in the context of families' everyday lives in their communities. So to begin with, I'm just going to start with, I guess, an explanation of what community development actually is. And it's one of those things where I think there can be quite varying understandings or different definitions that go around about community development, and it's also evolved over time. So I guess we can think of community development as a bit of an umbrella term, but really it's an approach and a process where people come together and they take action on things that are important to them. It helps communities to organise, to identify the issues that they want to address and the opportunities that they want to explore. So it's really about moving from private concern to public action. And just to break it down a little bit, the community part of it, I think community can sometimes feel a bit abstract to people, or we tend to think of it just in terms of maybe like a physical or geographic location. But when we talk about community here, we're really talking about networks of relationships, and those relationships are reciprocal and mutual and non-transactional, so not paid. And this could be more formal structures like church or religious groups, schools, places of work. And it's also about those informal support networks and groups. So that might be, sporting or hobby groups or family, friends or neighbours. The development part, it refers to a few different possibilities, but really it's that people have more power and more options and more choices in their lives as a result of participating in community development processes. So the idea is that people have a better chance when they're connected to each other and when they can work collectively. It is a profession and an academic discipline. There are people working in this space that have community development in their job title, but I did just want to point out that the approach and the principles can be incorporated into many different roles and undertaken by community members and citizens. It doesn't sit solely within the professional realm. I think in the compassionate communities work, we've noticed that there can be quite varied understandings of what community development means and what it looks like in that context. And I think in the compassionate communities context, it's not so much about awareness raising or giving information, even though that can be an important thing to do at times. But the community development part is really about empowering communities to design their own responses to looking after people who experience illness, death, dying, and loss. And this can't be about one-off standalone projects. It really requires sustained effort and relationship building over the long term. So I find that this explanation can be a good way of talking about developmental work, particularly for those of us that are working in an organisation or a service. So developmental work refers to working in a place or with a network of people relationally, listening to their ideas, bringing people together, supporting and adapting local activities as they emerge. So it's an adaptive practice. This tends to work in a way that's really very different to traditional service delivery, where a worker might kind of research best practice and different models, and then they land in a community or a place and deliver that model or deliver that best practice. So underpinning this developmental approach is the community development principle of start anywhere, go everywhere. So working with the energy and the enthusiasm of the people in a community while holding the service agenda lightly. So I think community development is it's a simple concept, but it can be kind of challenging to do, particularly for those of us that are working in organisations or institutions that don't aren't oriented that way or don't have a history of working in that way. So they're two very different ways of working, but it is possible to incorporate a community development orientation into a service-based organisation. So you can see in that table there, the key differences is that with a service delivery approach, it's about often about doing things for people, doing things to people, helping people out. It tends to be based on a one-way giving and about implementing your ideas or the services ideas. Whereas community building and development is about doing things with people, among people. It's based on relationships and collaboration. And this isn't to say that one, community development is better than service delivery. I think the reality is that we all need and want good services in our lives. It's really important. And in the world of palliative care, it's essential that there's good service systems. But the point is that it's not good services that make a good life. And what makes a good life is really about having a sense of purpose and connectedness and belonging. So we just kind of wanted to show you taking it down into what community development looks like at Hummingbird House. So I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but this just kind of gives you a visual of the different areas that we work in with this approach. So you'll see down in the bottom left there, we've got working with and connecting families in their communities. So one of the case studies we're going to share highlights how we do that. So it might be where there's kind of clusters of families living in a similar geographic area. And we work to build connections between health services, informal social networks, and families. Then there's working with families around shared interests or issues. So through conversations with families, we might find that individual concerns are actually shared concerns. And that's things like, the trickiness of navigating the NDIS system is something that often comes up. Also around, access to community facilities and things like that. So we look for where there's opportunities to work together with families around these shared concerns. There's also capacity building, resource development and education, which is an important part of the work. So that's around grief and death literacy, working with schools, and that's all really about increasing the capacity of others to be able to journey with families. Developing and building strategic partnerships, so with peak bodies like Palliative Care Queensland, the Queensland Children's Hospital, community centres, and then finally building capacity internally. So at Hummingbird House, looking at how we can incorporate a community development approach or principle into other areas of our work, so it doesn't just sit solely with the community development worker or the family support team.
Thanks, Cara. And this first case study example I'll give, I won't spend too long on, but it specifically is to speak to that piece of wondering how, as an interdisciplinary team, we could start to incorporate more community development focused approaches or thinking to existing ways of working. So I won't spend too long here. If these are models you haven't seen before, you can pause the recording and come back to them or send them out. Essentially, it's just to give this overview that, while palliative care is really great already at looking at recognizing a holistic approach to person-centered care, that we're made up of multiple parts, we then need to recognize that people's lives are made up of multiple relationships, and then the services that care are made up of multiple different organizations in societal structures. So in that second kind of middle between people network, we've been asking questions, in our team around how could we try and increase what capacity building approaches might look like in how we actually worked with families in a direct way. So looking in summary, one of the ways we did this that was central to how we begin to meet and hear family stories is we were able, in partnership with East Anglia Children's Hospice in the UK, to adapt a process that they shared with us initially, which was an existing evidence-informed holistic needs assessment. And we tweaked and broadened that process to make it more inclusive of social network mapping. And so, to kind of give some of the background or context for that, like straight from that, each community is prepared to help white paper from the UK, considering network mapping as a routine part of clinical care goes beyond the traditional genogram of simply family relationships to include all those important to the individual. And prompts should include asking about neighbours and friends and colleagues, shopkeepers, dog walkers, the emphasis being on gaining a picture of who forms the whole network and identifying the roles and strengths or losses or changes in relationships. And that's a key part of this visual tool we use called the Circles of Care. And this is foundational for enhancing the network to build a team around families, or enhance those teams, or look at where the gaps are and just to get a better understanding. And then the key part for us is when this information is able to be available to professional teams like ours, then the integration of services with the caring network is much easier. We'll be able to reduce duplication, but also identify things that might not be voiced initially if we only go in and ask about the immediate child's needs or the immediate family's needs. So this has been a challenge, but I think has worked really well again as an interdisciplinary process. And this was where applying some principles from community development thinking was able to adapt, an otherwise fairly, I guess, more standardized kind of palliative care tool to try and broaden that out, to really look at putting the family's life into a broader context. And one of the challenges with this, though, is that often as a result of the burden of care, outside of those green circles of family and friends, well, the first top half might be there, but often the family relationships have been significantly affected, friendships have been affected. And so those broader circles might be a lot more sparse than they may have been in previous times in a family's life. So thinking about that is just an example of one way in which, when working with individual families, we are seeking to broaden our approach. And I'll hand back to Cara to look at what that looks like when we hear common themes from looking at these kind of approaches together. And when we look side by side, say in a geographic region, Cara's going to share what that's looked like in the Wide Bay Burnett region.
Thanks, Ellen. So this is an example of us, how we work with families in their communities in one particular area. It's also about capacity building and working with families around shared issues. So Bundaberg is, for those of you that aren't from Queensland, it's a town with a population of around 70,000 and it's 360 kilometres north of Brisbane. So our community development workers have been visiting the area with other staff since about 2021. And it's been about building relationships with families, local government workers and other stakeholders. So it began, there was a family that has a long relationship with Hummingbird House, and they had expressed a sense of isolation. Most of their relationships were transactional, as Ellen has said. It tends to be the way for many families. So transactional and health related relationships, and they really wanted to be able to build and build connections and meet other people in the similar area to them that have a shared experience. So listening to this story, we worked alongside the family to invite other families that were known to Hummingbird House in that region to gather for lunch at the local neighbourhood centre. So really simple idea. We just reached out to people, said, hey, do you want to get together? So we travelled to Bundaberg for that, and we found people were really enthusiastic, and it became apparent that what was one family's private concern was actually a shared concern. So everyone felt that sense of isolation. And it was really over that first lunch that families began to connect. They shared stories, shared experiences, and made, I guess, started to build that sense of mutual support. So they decided that they would become a group. So the Hummingbird House Connecting Group of Bundaberg started, and they continue to meet today. They're meeting every couple of months, and sometimes we're able to go there and be there, but the group will also meet, without Hummingbird House staff present. And so they talk about challenges and issues, but there's also lots of fun and laughter and connection. And I really noticed that I've been to one of the family gatherings in Bundaberg, and I wasn't quite sure what to expect or how much facilitation I would need to do in terms of getting the conversation going. And I was amazed at, I barely needed to do anything, but everyone was just, instantly kind of sharing little tricky things that they were experiencing. There was, everyone had, a bit of a tip to share or words of encouragement. And it was just kind of, things were just flying across the room. And I could see how beneficial it was for families just to be able to meet together and support each other like that. One of the other things that came from this is that through our conversations with community service providers and school staff, we identified the need for grief and death literacy within school communities. So we worked collaboratively to organise a compassionate community conversation event, and that had a workshop on grief tending, and then there was a panel that was actually led by families, sharing about what's helpful and what's not when it comes to accompanying people at end of life. So I think this example, it really kind of demonstrates the principle of kind of see what people see in their communities and not coming in as experts with, solutions or preconceived ideas about what needs to be done or servicing needs. And it has been based on a premise that individuals and families, they have strengths and capabilities, and you can really harness them by working in participatory ways. And when we work alongside people, it's actually it's really empowering, and it builds in people's confidence and capabilities. So I'll just go on to the next example case study, which is about place-based community conversations or community education. So in 2021, Hummingbird House established a partnership with Caloundra Community Centre. So Caloundra is a coastal town in the Sunshine Coast region, which is just north of Brisbane. It has a thriving community centre, which is a great space for people to come and meet and connect, and they've got a range of different programs and services. And we knew that there were a number of families linked to Hummingbird House that lived in the Sunshine Coast region, which is a really quite a large geographic area. So it was right from the southern end to the northern tip. And the partnership began with an intention to connect these families with the community centre, with each other, and also to look at how we could build capacity of citizens to journey alongside families. It turned out that our initial and varied attempts at engaging families actually didn't work. And so we really had to pivot from our original thinking about what this partnership was and what it looks like and what we were trying to do. We really had to kind of just adapt and go where the energy was. What we did know from working with the community centre is that there were these kind of pre-existing conditions that for having community conversations. So, the community centre is already a welcoming, bustling hub for people. There seemed to be an appetite and an interest in the broader community in understanding more about death and dying and grief and how to support each other. The community centre worker had also completed the Compassionate Community Connector training with Groundswell. So these conversations began. A working group was established with some really enthusiastic community members, and the conversations continue today. There's been well over 100 people that have attended around a whole range of different topics. And I think just some of the key strengths of this particular approach to community education have been having a diverse working group. Over the last 3 years, there's been a whole range of different people that have been on the working group: community centre worker, local residents, end-of-life doula. There's been a palliative care nurse that's volunteering outside of her work time. And at one stage, we had someone that was living with a terminal illness who joined the working group, who sadly since died, but contributed an incredible openness and vulnerability in sharing his experience, which really added a lot of value to the conversations. The approach is always based on people's stories and experiences, and valuing that local knowledge and dialogue. And we have included experts and professionals because, sometimes there's topics that it's great to have someone like someone came to talk about advanced care planning or a lawyer to talk about wills. But the point has been that the learning is non-hierarchical, so it's drawn from the experience and the knowledge shared in the group. And we would often say that experts are on tap, so they're available. They're there to answer questions, provide information, which has been really invaluable, but they're never there to be on top. It's all about mutual sharing. That's just some pictures from the conversations. So I think we've kind of touched on, I think, some of the challenges, but just to summarize really quickly, the complex nature of families' lives can be a challenge to go at the pace of the people, which is what community development is all about. Sometimes it can feel easier and quicker to go for the doing to rather than doing with approach. So it really requires flexibility and patience. There's things that we've tried that haven't taken off, that have, such as with the Caloundra example, and it's required us to reassess ideas. Families are time poor, so even with initiatives where we felt like there was really high enthusiasm or interest, it hasn't necessarily translated into action, due to the day-to-day requirements and unpredictability of people's lives. We're also, I guess, pioneering new work in this space as a children's hospice. So there's a lack of other, tried and tested examples to draw on. But there's an opportunity within this of being able to be experimental and try things out. The other thing is measuring impact can also sometimes be a bit of a challenge. And I think with community development work, it can be difficult to kind of quantify. So if you're in a health system that wants measurement and outcomes, it can be difficult to kind of quantify the impact. But there's opportunity of looking for kind of creative ways to share the story and the work, and to be able to communicate its impact.
Thanks, Cara. And yeah, I think being realistic about our scope has definitely been a challenge, especially in the early stages. I came away from that first conference, as I say, with that white paper. I think I managed to download it and went to a pub all excited to sit by myself and read things, as I tend to do. And then, had this idea that we had to be working across all of these areas. But I think over time, it's been important to really focus in and just had to look at what's sustainable and what is our role as a hospice, and where we are, really just try and be strategic about partnerships, but also really ensure we're listening to families. And I think we absolutely do that across all areas of our service. But the other part we wanted to mention was, I think, moving from service provision thinking, particularly where we're often responding to such in the moment changes that might be in a child's condition or a family's broader crisis or other things, that it can be really, really hard, even when families are really on board with wanting to come together and do collective things. The challenges they're facing in their lives can make that difficult. And then as a service, I think we can sometimes be challenged by that, but just pulled in many directions at once, I think is what I'm trying to say here. Are we on to the next slide, Cara?
Yeah.
So you want me to start these off? Yeah. All right. So I think some questions we continue to ponder. As I said, we've been exploring this for a few years now, but we absolutely don't have all the answers. Sorry if that's what you're hoping for in the Q&A, which is coming shortly. But I think two that really stand out and have from the beginning. How does the broader compassionate communities movement, ensure that it takes a lifespan and indeed an intergenerational approach? Many of you will be familiar with that well-known Lancet article on the value of death and dying. And children are mentioned in that report, but they're mentioned in relation to bringing them into the process of adults dying within the community. I think the reality that children die in communities, not just across this state, across the country and the world, I think could, if that was incorporated across that lifespan approach, I think there's a lot of really valuable resources that could be collaborating more. So yeah, that was one. And then the second one, I think we've already touched on. Yeah, how can services avoid repeating these systemic issues? So yeah, I just thought the Utopia clip would be good for that, in terms of experts designing things in a room somewhere and then being kind of templated onto communities. That's a really clear message in this work. And Lee Donovan has put me onto this quote quite a while ago of from H.L. Mencken. I might be mispronouncing their name, but for every complex problem there is an answer that's clear, simple, and wrong. So yeah, how do we avoid that? And then blue sky thinking. Cara, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, because it's 2:20 now. Should we skip through to that that last bit, the one after this, so we can wrap up and have some time for discussion?
Sure. Yeah. So I think this last thing, there was a quote on the previous slide around ripples kind of stretching out from every action that we take much further than we often see. And I just wanted to, I'm not going to tell a lot of story here, but I think, when people say pictures can tell a lot more, within each of these family experiences that are connected to having received after-death care at Hummingbird House, every one of those families in different ways has either been able to use our hospice as this third community space. So it wasn't just that we opened the door and welcomed a family in, it was that they held that door open and welcomed in their community around them. So the family on the left are at the funeral of their son, and being able to call in their minister who had married them, less than a decade before, meant that we essentially just hosted an event that their community came together and organized. And then in that middle picture is a family spray painting a coffin for ahead of their child's funeral. And 2 or 3 years after this took place, some of those family members would come back into the hospice with another family who were preparing for end of life and then after death care, and kind of walk alongside them, in addition to the professional staff that were around. And then on the right hand, or on the far side, are two parents who experienced, death of their child and had an after death care referral here while they were still in birthing suite at hospital. And even during that time, they were thinking to themselves, oh, we rushed into hospital, we didn't have some of the essentials we needed. And they were starting to think about the needs of other families who might be in their position down the track. So none of those three examples are about things that Hummingbird House has set up a program for or professionalized in some way. These are things where families who have had experiences of what it looks like to come back into contact with knowledge and skill and experience around death and dying are then able to apply that to their own communities in a way that doesn't have to be tied to a service all the time. So we just wanted to speak to that piece as well, the things that take place far beyond the service. There are quite a number of resources and further information here. You could either just take a screenshot of that or check the recording. We'll send these out as well, just so we can allow time for some questions. If you do have to head off, I think Harp, we're maybe going to go on for a little longer if we can, but please do reach out to us if you've got particular questions about any of what we've spoken about. We're so up for talking to these things.
Thank
Thanks. I think
you.
I'll stop sharing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ellen. Thank you. So much, Kelly, Cara, and Ellen. That was so rich, and you took us, on a really big journey. I think one of the reasons we were so excited to have you, the three of you, to present today was because what you've shared with us is how services have the ability to be spaces of community connection, and how the role of community development can be integrated into services, but in an organic way where it's not about control. It's about letting go and facilitating that process, and that that just is so incredibly powerful, and I've taken away a lot from what you've shared. I'm sure many others have as well. So as you touched on, Ellen, we're really happy to go on for, to 2:45, whoever can stay. If not, like I mentioned, this is recorded, so you can catch up or email questions. But I'll just open it up. If you can put your hand up down at the bottom where it says reactions, there's that little smiley face. If you click on that, you can raise your hand, and then it'll come up in order of who would like to sort of kick things off. Anybody? I can't see anybody's hands. Nobody wants to ask questions?
Jessie's
Hand is up.
Thanks,
Oh,
Jessie.
okay.
Hello. That was so fabulous. Thank you, team. I'm really curious about this moment or bit when a family thinks less of themselves and more about others, like those 3 beautiful photos that you shared, Ellen, at the end. Did you make a direct invitation to them? Like, have you thought about, or would you be open to, or do you find that families come to that conclusion themselves of helping other people? What's that moment like? Could you say some more about that?
Look, I think in the simplest way, I'd say it's both, Jessie. Like, you've described it really well, the possibilities. And sometimes, we've got one of these principles we talk about in after-death care of invitation, and that sits alongside information, because if you don't know what's even possible, then how would you know to ask for a thing? But I think making invitations, particularly around where that might be inviting, like I said, holding the door open and bringing the rest of your community in. Like, when you're inside a building, as much as we talk about it as a home away from home, there are clinical signifiers in the space that tell you we're in an organization. People don't assume that it's okay to invite in their family, and they're like, but they're loud and they're messy, and it's, so I think that's one side. And then the other side is, like, just every single month we come into contact with families who, obviously we're really humbled to learn so much from families we work alongside, but it really does just continue to stretch both your mind and your heart to wonder how people in circumstances like the families facing that we walk alongside can, not 2 years later or 5 years later for some of them, like in that moment, asking those very questions. Kelly, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I was going to say similar. I think space and invitation. And one thing, Hummingbird House, the space really facilitates well is rest. And I think when families are given space to breathe and rest at the end of their child's life or after their child has died, then they're given space for imagination. And maybe that is not the same in more of a clinical hospital setting. I'm not sure, but we learn so much from families over the years just by walking alongside and listening. So as Ellen said, sometimes families they just don't know what the possibilities can be. So we may share other families' words of wisdom, and then that may open ideas for those families.
Thank you. That's just unlocked something really big for me. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Any more questions? You've done such a good job, team, presenting so well.
Hi, folks. Sorry, it's Libby here. I just have a question about schools and how you might see the involvement of schools.
Yeah, I mean, Cara and Peter, I don't know if either of you would like to speak to that from a broader community point first, or I can start. I'm happy to start. I just don't want to take up all the airspace. You want me to start?
You can start.
Okay. So I think the first thing is the first and shortest, quickest answer is it depends. So, you know, in terms of I suppose it depends. If you're asking in relation to our connection and support with schools, I think again sometimes it's letting families and communities know that that's even an option, because I think the assumption might be that if it's a children's hospice, you're there to care and focus, you know, on providing support for the children. Whereas we do take this community-centric approach. I think, again, there can be concerns and worries, as I'm sure many people know here, if you've walked alongside anyone living with serious illness or approaching end of life, there can be concerns and worries that loom really, really large. Like we often talk about shadow puppets here, like the thing might be quite small, but the shadow it casts is really huge. And I think at the way that schools are, you know, the way a family worries about how a child may continue or not continue to go to school, or how siblings may return to school after a death. I think lots of those things can be really well supported with the provision of information and room for conversations. And so maybe the simplest thing to say in a broad sense would be taking a listening approach with both families or a school community, I think helps us to look and listen for what that concern might be, and then not to pre-assume what a solution is. So sometimes staff will say we need professional counselling or we need psychology or something for a student, and then proceed to list all these amazing things they're doing in the classroom to honour and include grief, but they just don't feel like that's enough, or maybe that they're quote unquote qualified to be providing that support. Whereas often for children, it's the people who are already in their lives that they're wanting and needing support from. But of course, with something like schools, it's from the ground to the top and back again. There needs to be action in all of the levels and spaces. Cara and Peter, do you want to add anything?
Just that, you know, I think the potential of the role of schools in terms of building compassionate communities can't be understated. I think you know, school community is such an important part of children's and families' lives, and there's such great potential in terms of how they support students, you know, where there's loss and grief. Yeah, so I think that's a really important area of work.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
So I have a question. I can't see anyone else's hands at this stage. And that was to do with, you know, Cara, you took us through the process of how a community development worker, that role came up. And I guess being a private hospital, essentially a private health service, how was that received? Because that's a really unique, you know, way of working, which makes complete sense to many of us. But for others who are based in health services, and this might be a question for you, Kelly, around, you know, was that, you know, welcomed with open arms? Was there internal advocacy? Like, what did that look like internally when it came to embracing like a different, unique way of working?
You want me to go, Cara? Yeah. Extremely challenging. I guess we're developing and talking about a community approach within a system that has not necessarily experienced this type of approach before. So I think it takes perseverance and a lot of advocacy, and using words that I've used this morning, actually, trying to find inventive ways of explaining the model of care, and I referred to it this morning as interpretive dance. So we have been busting new moves out for many, many years. So you're slowly chipping away, chipping, and the team with Peter and Ellen and Cara do an amazing job at doing that, and really staying grounded and true to the principles. But yeah, it absolutely continues to be challenging. Ellen or Peter, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, look, I think I agree with all of that, and we had some prevailing conditions that meant there was this unique opportunity, but I don't mean that to sound like it then makes, if your service has been established for longer, that you couldn't do this, because the prevailing conditions in your context might be, we've been trying this for a decade, and this either isn't working or we need to try something different. So I think ensuring that we took the time, like when I think back to, like, we found a not big amount of money, but approached someone with expertise in this space to say, would you be able to think some really hard and painful questions, because we've got to go and keep caring for families, but would you be able to think around how this existing body of literature and international practice might apply specifically at a children's hospice? And we did that twice. Once when we were developing the team, and then another time when we've been looking at what does that look like to think more regionally across the state. And we've not been able to move as much as we'd like to with that, because again, with service-wide, we're still trying to ensure we've got sustainability, both in terms of roles, but funding, like all of those things are in play, as I'm sure they are for every service. So yeah, I think those are some extra thoughts. And yeah.
Yeah, thank you both. Peter.
Well, Karen's had her hand up for a while, but I was just going to say that quote Cara gave, which really is acknowledged Cormac Russell in Ireland, we all need services, but services don't make a good life, is a really good one to reflect on in this compassionate community space when you are located in a service, because it's to recognize that people want this service. It needs to be high quality. But with our professional gaze, we get such a small glimpse into the everyday life. And I think that's what compassionate community lens is really helpful, yeah? Just broadens that gaze to explore and listen. Yeah, that's all.
Yeah, thank you all. I think, paving the way and creating that role, and I guess, once someone's done the hard yards, it does make it easier for other services to be able to look at what you've done as a roadmap and be able to potentially advocate and adapt that. So deep gratitude for persisting and continuing to persist in that way. Karen, I'll throw to you.
Hi, so I'm really new to this. I did training a year ago to become an end-of-life doula here in South Australia. So it's very, very new here in South Australia. So I was actually a trained SSO, so I have worked in schools and stuff. So with the questions and the conversation before, I just wrote down things like, is there possibility for grief training for either chaplains in schools or SSOs to have training specialising in grief to do with children, because they are working with children in schools, and maybe collaborating with the education department and seeing if there's an opportunity, like you said here, trying things out and being experimental, but being realistic about the capacity and scope. So I just thought I'd just throw that out there as well. I've really enjoyed everything everyone said, and I'd love to have a private conversation with some of you later, because I've got lots of questions, like I said, because I'm new to this space. But value what you've shared and what you guys are doing. It's just amazing. So pat yourselves all on your back. It's a really unique and special space to work in, and it really is a calling. It's not just a job, as everyone in this group would know. So yeah, so thank you, and got my L plates on, but yeah, really happy to be on the Zoom today. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for sharing that. And I guess a couple of practical things just come to mind for anyone else maybe wondering around that schools piece specifically, and that's that thankfully there's some great examples. The ones we know of are over in the UK, but I believe it's St Nicholas Hospice. So it's an adult hospice, but they partnered with schools to make a grief buddy program. So younger, children across the primary school who've been bereaved have a few workshop sessions and then have a badge, and then another child who's bereaved comes back to school and they can go and talk to a grief buddy. So they don't have to seek out like the counselor or the professional adult. It can be, again, at that peer level, like just trusting children to support each other as well, right? So like at the local level, that's one example where like we've only been able to achieve what we have because there was a lineage of people who've been doing this work for a longer time. And sure, they haven't done it in a children's hospice, but we've been able to draw on so much wisdom. So I just want to encourage people. There's so many resources out there, both in the direction of community development, but also compassionate communities and public health. And yes, we need, education department policy, that level. But if you're at a school or connected to a school and there isn't enough being done around grief, or there's energy there to make something happen, one of the resources we have on the slide is called Speaking Grief. It's a US produced documentary, but what they've done is a really great approach where they've made guides for teachers and for community group facilitators and death cafes. So there's multiple levels of like how to watch a film, how to then look at how it applies to our context. So you don't need to, wait for any departmental approval to do projects that are really practical if you know a couple of other parents or you're connected on the ground. So it's kind of that, from the bottom up and from the top down. Yeah.
Thank you, Ellen. I think there's just in the chat, Hannah's just asked what that organization's called, Ellen, that you just mentioned, but we'll be sending out the slides. So there was that resources page at the end of the presentation, and there was a number of great resources that Hummingbird House is listed there, so that will go out to everyone. So don't worry about too much about all the links because they will come through. So I'd just like to take a moment again to, deeply thank Kelly, Cara, and Ellen for this, wonderful presentation and for sharing so deeply, along with Peter, who supported Hummingbird House. And thank you all for making the time to join us. It was a first session and we had 78, I think it was, registrations, and the recording will be going out to people who couldn't make it, but we'll be sharing every month. So every month there'll be a new conversation series. So next month it's going to be on the arts and compassionate communities. So there'll be more information about that coming out soon too. So have a gentle afternoon ahead, everyone. And it's so great to see everyone connecting nationally.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay.